In this video, we're going to talk about shaders within the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. Alright, so in my first run of Retroarch tutorials for Xbox, I included sections on shaders for each of them. As I've gone through and made updates to it, I really didn't feel like including a shaders section anymore because it's just repeating a lot of the same information that could be covered in a standalone shader video, such as this. Shaders are a matter of personal preference on whether or not you want to use them, which ones look good to you, which ones don't. So this is just kind of a basic overview of how to just enable them, as well as how to add your own if you so choose. But let's go ahead and dive in. Alright, so before we start messing around with shaders on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch, you need to decide up front if you are going to be adding any shaders to your Retroarch install, or if you're going to be happy with just the ones that come pre-included in the shader download. Chances are you've already installed the shaders through the online updater. If you followed my initial setup guide, I showed you how to do that. But that saves shaders to the Q drive, so it makes it a little bit more difficult to manually add in your own. So the first thing I'm going to do in this video is actually move my shader directory over to my S drive, just because I don't want to deal with the Q drive. I don't want to deal with my Files Explorer. I don't want to deal with any of that crap because it's stupid. So instead, I'm going to access my Xbox's internal SSD through my development files file share that I set up in my original Retroarch install guide. If you haven't checked that out yet, go back and do so. But gain access to your development files file share. Go into your Windows Apps folder, Retroarch folder, and now we are going to make a new folder and name it Shaders. Done. And I'm just going to go ahead and leave this up, but we're going to switch over to the Xbox side of things real quick. Over on the Xbox, I'm going to go into Retroarch, and from here, over to Settings, go over, press up to go up to Directory, enter this, and now we're going to look for the Shaders entry. There it is, video shaders. Alright, so we're going to change this from the Q drive over to our S drive. So S, Program Files, Windows Apps, Retroarch folder, grab the shaders folder and tell it to use this directory. And now we just need to get the shaders re-downloaded to our new directory. So go back over, go up to main menu, go to Online Updater, and tell it to update slang shaders. And with those shaders downloaded to their new directory, we just need to make sure that we save the config file, so that way it always looks for those in the S drive. So just save current config. There we go. But now we're ready to start applying these shaders to our games. And again, shaders are very personal preference. But I went ahead and got loaded into Need for Speed Underground here for GameCube. And I'm going to go into my Retroarch quick menu to apply the shaders. So head down to the Shaders tab. And you just need to enable video shaders. It might be off by default, it might be on by default. But then to load up a shader, you go up to this Load tab. Then you go into the Shader Slang folder. And there's so many different shader presets available within Retroarch by default. Like, it's crazy. And again, these are going to be mostly personal preference on which ones you really like. For me personally, I like heading into the CRT folder and applying CRT Easy Mode. And now within the game, it gives you this sort of aperture grill look like you would find on a CRT desktop monitor or a higher-end CRT or professional video monitor. Not quite the same, but similar enough that I really enjoy it. But there's so many more options available within those shaders tabs. Again, there's just so freaking many. Like, you go in and, like, CRT alone, there's just so many. I know that some of the favorite ones include the Royals or the Geom shaders themselves. So I mean, another folder I recommend checking out inside the load shaders option is the preset folder. There's a number of different presets here that can give you a really interesting look. So for example, let's go with CRT Geom Upscale. So that gives us a faint hint of some scan lines, as well as just kind of the color banding you'd get from a CRT screen. It's not personally a favorite of mine, but I mean, it's an interesting look. But once you find a shader that you want to use for a specific core, head down to Save, and save them as a core preset. Or if there's a shader you want to have set for one game but not another, you can save them as a game preset. But I'm going to save this as my core preset for Dolphin. And now I'm going to apply that same shader to my PS2 games because I really like the way this looks for Gen 6 and on, like I said. And there we go. Now I have it on my PS2 games as well, and it really helps with this native PS2 image I have. I don't have my PS2 games upscaled right now, but it looks really good when combined with a CRT shader. And again, once you have the shader set for the core the way you want it to be, make sure to go in and save it as a core preset. Alright, so bringing it back a generation here, N64. I like to use the Angry Lion plugin because I like having accurate representations of N64 rendering. Personal choice on my part, but it does result in an image that doesn't necessarily look that great on a modern LCD display. I don't really mind it myself personally, but others might. So, for this system, I actually like to go into that preset folder I mentioned earlier. So going into shaders, load. I'm going to go into this presets folder, and I like to load up the CRT Guest Dr. Venom Max DR shader. It really sharpens up the appearance of the game and adds in, okay scan lines. But overall, it just makes this system really pop. It's a little bit darker than I would personally prefer, but that's okay because we can actually go in, back to our shaders tab. And if we go to shader parameters, we can actually increase the brightness a little bit here. So I'm just going to crank this up to by 0.10 and see what that does for us. Alright, there we go. So, creases it a little bit, and overall, it looks pretty nice. But again, once you have the shaders configured the way you want, you can go in and save them as a core preset. Alright, let's talk about my favorite use of shaders here real quick, and that's for handheld consoles like PSP, Game Boy Advance, well, the whole Game Boy line, DS, and things like that. So I have Soul Calibur loaded up here on PSP, and I'm going to go into my Retroarch quick menu. Now, for shaders to work correctly, at least in the way I'm going to show you here, there are some things you need to do. First, your PSP games need to be at native resolution, because if they're not, the shader will be messed up. And we also need to go into our video tab and disable integer scaling if you have it enabled. I like having it enabled, that's just me personally, but with shaders, it doesn't really play nice with it, so we kind of have to disable it for this. But that's fine because this shader integer scales the image for us anyway. Once you've ensured that those options are set the way you need them to be, we can go back up into the quick menu, head down to shaders, and this time we're going to go into the handheld folder and console border. Now I'm going to press up on my D-pad to bring me down to the PSP section here real quick, and I'm going to load up PSP 3x scale. And now I have a nice scaled PSP image with a PSP console border on it, and it looks fantastic in motion. And I just absolutely love the way that this looks. I love having that PSP border, the LCD scan line, or LCD grid lines, and just, it looks really good. But same thing as before, if you find the image to be a little bit too dark, you can always go into the shader parameters and lower the intensity of the LCD grid strength. And then you can apply the changes. And then when you go back into the game, it will be a little bit brighter, just because the lines aren't as dark. But again, once you have all these options set the way you want them to be, go into save, and save them as a core preset. And there's something else we need to do here as well, since we had to change some global settings. We're going to go out and save those as a core override, so that way they don't interfere with the rest of our cores that I personally want to have integer scaling enabled for. And now just another quick example here with Game Boy Advance. Going into my Retroarch quick menu. I'm going to back out, go up to the settings. Going to turn off integer scaling. And now I'm going to go down to shaders. Load. Handheld folder. Console border. And we're looking for GBA, and we're going to apply the 3x shader. Now, things on GBA are slightly different here. We do need to actually go back into that video tab and change the aspect ratio just to 16:9. Because when it's set to core provided, it will crop some of the outside edges, which is fine. So we just need to set this to 16:9 or full. Shouldn't really matter a whole lot. But the 3x shader is a little bit too small for my taste, so let's go ahead and load up the 4x. There we go, that's a little bit more like it. Now, depending on your GBA core options, you might need to change some things in here as well because of the shader. So, for example, I have color correction enabled for Game Boy Advance games. The shader color corrects to this as well. And for in-frame blending, the shader has its own type of ghosting enabled, so we can actually disable the ghosting within the core options as well. Just because if we have them both enabled, we get an extra strong blurring that doesn't look quite right. But now when we go into our game, we have a nice LCD blurred color corrected GBA image with a GBA console border, and it looks friggin' awesome in motion. Well, as long as you like accurate representations of GBA LCD blur, that is. Some people don't like it, so worth noting. But just as every other time before, save these as a core preset. And then for GBA, since we changed those other options, we need to save those as a core override as well, so that way it doesn't mess with the rest of our stuff. Alright, time for another handheld example here with original Game Boy. So we're going to have to change a lot of things around here for this to really take a good effect. First things up again, go into settings, video, scaling, disable integer scaling if you have it on, and change the aspect ratio down to full. After that's set, you can go back into the quick menu. We need to change the Game Boy color palette over to grayscale. And once these are set, we can head down to the Shaders tab. Load up our handheld border shader folder. And we can load up original Game Boy. It's the DMG. That's the model of original Game Boy. And we can load that up to a 4x scale. That's a little bit small. There we go, 5x. That's where I'll go with it. And now once we're inside, you can see that it applies that greenish shade for us automatically, as well as gives us the nice Game Boy border. And now I'm just going to save that as a core preset. And I'm going to save the core overrides, so that way it loads up right every time I try to load it in. Now, this is where things are going to get a little bit more interesting if you have your games separated like I do. I have a couple of backwards compatible Game Boy Color games in my Game Boy folder. So for example, my Pokemon Yellow. Well, I guess I only had one. But Pokemon Yellow, this is a Game Boy Color game. But I have it set in Game Boy mode right now. And so, I mean, it's perfectly playable this way, but we're not getting the full advantage of the game. So what I'm going to do here instead, I'm going to go into the core options. I'm going to change the system type that's being emulated over to a Game Boy Color. Then I'm going to tell it to turn off the color correction because I'm going to apply a Game Boy Color shader to this. And now I'm going to go up to Manage Core Options and save them as a game options file. So that way when I load up Pokemon Yellow, those are the options that show up and they don't affect the rest of my Game Boy games. But now I'm just going to close Pokemon Yellow and rerun it. So it's loaded up into Game Boy Color mode, but we still have this Game Boy shader applied to it, so it's not quite right yet. But from here, just go into the Shaders tab. Gonna load up a handheld shader, console border, and I'm gonna find Game Boy Color. Here we go, GBC, and I'm gonna apply the 5x scale to that one as well. And there we go. Now we have Pokemon Yellow showing up as a Game Boy Color game, even though it's in my even though it's in my original Game Boy playlist. That way it's just accurate. But now I'm gonna go into the Shaders tab, and I'm gonna save this as a game preset because I don't want this to mess up the rest of my Game Boy playlist. So now, when I close out of my Game Boy, when I close out of Pokemon Yellow, I can load back into, say, Pokemon Red, and it shows up as an original Game Boy game. And close out of that. And when I go back into Pokemon Yellow, It's a Game Boy Color game. Hooray. So that's how you can handle things in the same core, but you want different things for. Alright, so now I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about how to add in your own shaders if you want to. So one of the things I like to do this with is for Nintendo DS. There's no handheld border shader by default, so I like to grab Tatsuya's handheld border shader pack. So just download the slang version of this. And once I have it downloaded, I just need to get it extracted. And there we go. So now I have a new handheld border shaders file here. And there's a lot more handhelds included within this than what were originally available. So now I just need to get this handheld border folder into the shaders folder that I created at the start of this video. So I left my development files file share open. I'm going to go into the shaders folder, shader slang, and I'm just going to add that in. Alright, so I've loaded into a Nintendo DS game. Unfortunately, the handheld border shaders for Nintendo DS only work under DeSmuME, and DeSmuME only works with DeSmuME 2015. It's not my preferred way to play Nintendo DS games anymore, but I still wanted to show the shader off for those of you that are still using this core. So, a couple things we needed to change here. So going into our quick menu, we can go out, go into settings. We need to change the scaling again, make sure integer scaling's turned off, and the aspect ratio is set to full. Now we can go back into the quick menu, go into the shaders. We're going to load up a shader from that folder we just put in. So shader slang, handheld border, and we're going to go with the DS 90 2x scale. Unfortunately, because of the size of DS screens and the width apart, we can't go above 2x scaling on this version of Retroarch yet. But after we apply it, you can see that the screen doesn't quite look right. It's being covered by the Nintendo DS border. And that's one of the reasons why this doesn't work under Melon DS currently. We have to set the screen gap. So going in, go into options, and then you can set the screen gap up to 90. That way it is applied correctly and has the correct layout of a Nintendo DSi. And then we could just begin playing things, and it looks absolutely fantastic. But, again, save them as a core preset, and then save that as a core override, so that way it doesn't mess up any of your other stuff. But that's where I'm going to call it with shaders. Go through each and every one of your cores, find a shader that you like, apply it, and save it as a core preset, so that way every time you load up that core, that shader will greet you. As always, if you happen to have any questions regarding shader setup, you can feel free to ask me in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to try to help you out. Again, most of the time when it comes to shaders, it's all going to be personal preference, so there's really no best option. It's just whatever you feel looks good for the games you're playing. But now, if you could all do me a couple of huge favors, please be sure to hit that like or dislike button, just depending on how much you like today's tutorial. And if you haven't done so already, hit that sub button so you can see when new videos go live on the channel. It goes a long way to helping us keep the growth of the place up, and then you get to see when new videos come out, so I mean, win-win, right? If you'd like to further help support the channel, you could also check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, where you could join the ranks of our amazing champions who have just been super amazing at believing in what we do and keeping this place going. Thank you all so much for being such rock stars. But that's going to do it for this one, so until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, and we will see you back next video.